evening, everybody. It's Randy with Heartbreaker Relics. I'm at Spike's over in Long Beach, Mississippi. We're going to continue on with our Native American 101 series. In tonight's episode, which is we're calling It's All Artifacts, we want to talk about everything that we find as far as lithics. Spike will jump in every now and then, and he's going to interject and throw in some examples of what we're talking about. When we say lithics, we're talking about strictly the stone tools that were made by Native Americans. We don't find the organic matter, which those tools would have been with, whether it was bone, wood, antler, that type thing. It just degrades over time. We started this series mainly because of the questions we get after our videos and just in the general public when we're talking with people. And those questions are, you know, what kind of arrowhead is this? What kind of arrowhead is that? Typically, what we find in this area, everybody calls points, and even we refer to it as points. Most of the time, it's a knife. It would have been something that would have been hafted on bone, handle, or wood. Those type things down here, because of the material we have, which is Mississippi citronelle gravel chert, which you don't get a lot of big pieces of that. Those type tools were going to be smaller. They were going to be maybe 3.5, 4 inches, maybe 4.5 inches at the most. Those would have been knives or blades. You'll hear us talk about blades, and that would have been a knife. It would have been something they would have carried, used to skin, cut, that type thing. You get up into central Mississippi, lower central Mississippi, where you get into the Tallahassee quartzite belt, and you get a lot bigger rock. That band of rock stretches from central Alabama into Mississippi, 6 or so counties. So you see typically some of those points are a lot larger. And Spike's going to throw in some examples of what we're talking about here, what we find with the gravel chert and what we also find in the Tallahassee quartzite. You get on up in the northern Mississippi, Arkansas, Tennessee, that area, they had bigger rocks, had bigger tools. So when you have that, you'll see a vast difference in what people made and what they did with it. Some of those, the larger pieces, may have been spear points. We don't know for fact because there's no written record of the Native Americans and what they used those tools for. All we can do is infer what we know about other cultures around the country, around the world rather. We know that in places like Africa, South America, Central America, Australia, they develop throwing spears, the spears that they may run and just stick something with. But typically what we find are the knives and blades. And they would have been a hafted tool, and we'll show some examples of those and how they may have been hafted. Typically, arrowheads would have been reserved for later on in the woodland and Mississippi period. A lot of what we find are dart points, and when we say dart points, we're talking about they would have been used on an atlatl, which an atlatl would have been a throwing type spear, but it would have been a smaller diameter, maybe 6.5 foot long, and it would have been used with a handle to give it more leverage, to being able to throw farther and a lot more accurate than just throwing a large stick with a stone tool in the end of it. We find a lot of dart points. Those are going to be in a range of, you know, maybe 3/4 inch up to 2 inches in that area. A lot of the Gary points that we find, if it's long, slender, and pointed, more than likely it was a dart point in that area. Talk about cultures down in South America, Central America, even in Africa, Australia. The Atlatl is still used today. It's been used for thousands of years. You can look that up. That's kind of cool little series on the cultures that are still using those. Here in South Mississippi, they was probably used for herd animals. We had bison, we had elk here in South Mississippi over the last few thousand years, and would have probably been used to kill those type of animals, deer in herds, or I imagine they would have got pretty good with them as far as accuracy. The true arrowheads that we find here in Mississippi date back from around 1500 BC in the woodland period all the way into the Mississippian period, somewhere around 400 years ago. The first true arrowhead used in Mississippi was the Collins Point. We have the Bayou Gula, which is one of our favorites because it's a really cool looking point. The Alba and the Mouse Creek. Those were used by or used on a bow and an arrow as we know it. Here recently in South Mississippi, there was a bow recovered in one of the bayous here that had been covered up in mud and preserved because there's no oxygen and rotted, and it was taken out. And we're going to include a little link to the article on that because that's kind of cool. Like I said, you don't really find a lot of the organic material because of decay here in the South, but it's kind of neat to find out. I know in Arizona and places out west, sometimes they find that stuff in the more arid areas where decay is not as much of a problem. Here, being as wet and hot as it is, it doesn't last very long. Those are the 4 main points we find here as far as arrowhead, true arrowhead points. Here later on, we'll delve into the other lithics like axes, adze, celts, the nutting stones, hammer stones, even talk a little bit about pottery, talk a little bit about game balls, some of the other things that we found that are not necessarily the lithic part, but some of the stuff that's been held over from the latter periods. Still find a lot of pottery. We found a couple of beads, one of those from right after European contact when it was a trade bead. And we actually found one that was a stone bead. So it would have probably been, archaic type period. But we're going to show a lot of examples of these as we go through this in Spike Wheel anyway. If there's any questions that you guys have after this video, like I said, that's what we were doing this for, was to answer questions. We're no experts by any stretch of the imagination. We do this because we like it. It's a hobby. We enjoy this part of it. If you have a comment, you want to ask us a question, please ask a question. We'll try to do something, give a good answer. If you want to leave a comment or something that will to enlighten us, by all means, please leave that for us. We're trying to share our knowledge with you and try to answer some of the questions that we get online and in person a lot. Enjoy having you. Take care, and we'll see you on the next one.